Hello all, I hope you are well. You are kindly welcome to the first full lecture in this Introduction to Philosophy course, where I will give a preliminary answer to the question, what is philosophy? It should set up the rest of the course as well as its methodology. Today then I will first outline and justify the approach of the course, and then the main part of the lecture will be concerned with giving some preliminary answers to the basic question, what is philosophy? I will give this answer through providing some general definitions, classical objects of study, some permanent subdomains, historical disciplines and movements, and some main general traits I see philosophy to have, and it's been considered to have over the years. I'll then finish with a few disclaimers about the course as well as a note as to the general format. First then, the approach for this course. I will take a primarily chronological, historical approach, focused on the most basic and most famous figures and ideas throughout the history of philosophy, and how this progresses and develops over the centuries. So this will be a historical introduction to Western philosophy, so from ancient Greece to many modern-day contemporary societies and professional academic philosophy now. Including anything beyond this would be too much for any beginner's course. It is already a lot. And quite frankly, going beyond Western philosophy would be beyond my own capabilities and qualifications. Before we enter fully into this approach in the next lecture, here we can begin by going through some general definitions, some of the most dominant and permanent subdomains of philosophy, a few classical objects of study, a note on historical disciplines and movements, as well as some main general traits. First then, simply by asking a question, especially what or why something is, can already be seen as an everyday case of philosophy. Thus, asking what is philosophy is already to embark on a philosophical attitude and stance. So the title of the lecture has already begun us on our path, a path that all humans seem to have the inherent capacity for. If one does not do this explicitly as a trained discipline, to generally ask questions about the world and phenomena around one is already to adopt an inquisitive, questioning and reflexive spirit that is definitively human and seems to begin as young as 2 or 3 or 4 years old. Thus, a general proclivity to question some of the basic ideas and phenomena already gives a hint as to one of the major elements involved in philosophy, precisely questioning about basic things through a pensive, reflexive attitude. Stemming on from this, we may also briefly look at the word itself, not least its etymology. Like a lot of terms in philosophy, it has its origin in ancient Greek. So philosophy is actually made up of 2 ancient Greek words, philia and sophia, which together mean lover or friend, philia, of wisdom, sophia. So a philosopher is a lover or friend of wisdom, wants to expand his or her knowledge and understanding through pursuing and acquiring wisdom. Philosophy in this manner could be seen as a science of wisdom, broadly construed, that is, as a system of answers to the deepest and most fundamental questions we have. Answers and questions that need not be static and answered once and for all, as we will see repeatedly throughout the history of philosophy. I think another nice answer to the question, what is philosophy, is a kind of non-answer attributed to Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest ever philosophers and one we will definitely see more of later. Apparently, when asked what philosophy is by a student, after delaying and thinking about it, he said he cannot answer that. He cannot say what philosophy is, but through his course and teachings and his writings, he does hope that one will learn how to philosophize as a verb, a trained and sustained action. Although I, of course, am no Kant, I hope a similar thing might occur through this course. Another answer is in this cluster is the idea that philosophy is simply thinking about thinking. So in our daily lives, we are busy thinking about various things at work, practical errands and things, our relationships, our desires, so on. The idea here is that philosophy is when thought puts itself under the microscope, and one thereby studies concepts and ideas and how they relate to everything else. This can be seen as the birth of theory, but it can also be misconstrued and misrepresented. Indeed, philosophy has a negative caricature as concerning oneself with useless, abstruse issues that have no real bearing on anything. Some philosophers would even argue that philosophy is necessarily useless. It has to be useless in order to be objective and pure. I think philosophy studies and forms concepts, for example, freedom, fundamental to all types of human life. Concepts that, if not immediately, at least eventually have profound impacts on structuring many fabrics throughout human society and behavior, and thus this caricature as useless is just that. Although undoubtedly some philosophy does seem to speculate without ever having further influence and thereby fades away. The philosophers and theories that do not fade away, however, are precisely those that have touched on some fundamental issue that has influenced people and society, and thus it is far from ineffective and useless. When philosophy first arose, it was the linchpin or parent domain to nearly all other disciplines, from mathematics and logic to more practical applications in issues like in ethics and politics. Now human knowledge and investigation has grown and diversified so much that many previous sub-disciplines are massive, independent ones in their own right nowadays. And even here, I would still maintain that philosophy still kind of pervades many because it in essence remains the practice of questioning and establishing fundamental concepts, which can then be applied, used, and taken up throughout human study and life in multitudinous ways. There is no one answer to the question, therefore. I hope these remarks at least give you an initial impression and inspire you to start thinking about the matter yourself. And then you are already halfway on the path to thinking about thinking, to philosophizing. Another way to get a preliminary impression as to what philosophy is or might be is to look at some of its most permanent subdomains or categories, which I have listed here in alphabetical order. These are domains of study that nearly any philosopher or philosophy deals with in one way or another, has to deal with, no matter the particular epoch or discipline. Although there are, of course, many variations, and I will get to this, these subdomains remain in one form or another throughout the history of philosophy and probably always will remain so, even if just in a negative, criticized form. And thus they kind of constitute the architectonics and many of the categories of most or all philosophies or philosophers. So first, aesthetics nowadays it has a narrower meaning of a theory of art and beauty, but originally it was just about feeling, the senses and perception, and some basic experiences linked to this. Basically, aesthetics had to do with the more immediately felt and lived aspects of experience, which then also lend themselves very well, of course, to artistic creation, imagination, expression, and enjoyment, not least through our experiences of pleasure and beauty. So it thus studies the more intuitive and indeed aesthetic elements of human reality and experience. Often opposed to this, epistemology is the study of what we can know, made up of logos, which can be translated both as logic and as study, and episteme, which means knowledge, one of the Greek terms for knowledge. It is what nowadays is known as a theory of knowledge, and details what and how humans, and other beings for that matter, can know what they do, what such knowing entails, as well as the various types of knowledge. Generally then, it is a theory of understanding, knowing, belief, cognition, and reasoning. Ethics is the normative study of human action, behavior, and valuing, and often uses argumentation to say what we should and should not be doing, as opposed to what is or is not the case. So, as numerous philosophers have observed, not least David Hume, other subdomains in philosophy talk about what is or how things are, whereas ethics is about what should be. Ethics is thus the main branch of philosophy that prescribes, recommends, even commands, and is thus often the most practical and applied part, not least for lawmaking and moral guidance throughout the centuries, and it remains as crucial to human social, moral, and political life as it ever did. Next on the list is metaphysics, which has fallen in and out of favor over the years, but has always been a major domain in philosophy, whatever the philosophy, whether viewed positively or negatively. It is another term made up of two Greek terms, meta and physis. So although nowadays physics means the study of mainly lifeless matter, back then physis meant nature, much more broadly speaking, including all forms of life. Meta kind of means behind or underneath, kind of supporting, and thus metaphysics was usually the study or theory of basic, invisible principles of nature, as we will especially see with Aristotle and going on from him. Basically, it is any theory of nature expressed in a conceptual abstract form, and indeed it can be one of the most abstract subdomains, but also it has many variations and turns down the years as well. Often related to metaphysics, but with a different emphasis, is what is known as ontology. Onto means being or that which is, which means ontology is the study or theory of being, of basic and fundamental reality. This again has many variations throughout history, but nearly all philosophers have to say something about ultimate realities and beings, even if it is to deny that we can really know anything about them. For example, Kant says something about like this. Thus, ontology is more focused on ultimate realities and actual beings, whereas metaphysics more about the universal principles of nature, for example, causality, with both often rather on the theoretical and abstract side, although later existential ontologies, like Heidegger's or Sartre's, can also be quite concrete at times. Often less theoretical and abstract is the fact that any philosophy and philosopher has to broach the issue of psychology and anthropology from a conceptual perspective. Now, of course, psychology and anthropology are domains and disciplines in their own right. One can now even distinguish more philosophical varieties of anthropology and psychology that use concepts from more applied empirical and or data-driven types. More generally, though, throughout the history of philosophy, talking of the human psyche, so the mind, the spirit, or the soul, we'll leave them together for now, and of the human being, so anthropo, in general, was an unavoidable and crucial part to any complete theory. Actually, the human mind and human being are seen quite intuitively intuitively, often at the very center of any possible theory. So to put it another way, philosophy has always found itself in a peculiarly human context, and although many schools believe one can abstract away from human particulars and obtain objective insights and levels, and many will of course claim that you cannot do this, even in both extremes, how humans and their minds fit in with all the rest is always an absolutely foundational issue, meaning philosophical psychology and anthropology will forever remain crucial as well. From theories of basic experiences like perceptions, emotions, acts of imagination, and so on, to more general and societal issues such as common sense, communal being, and humans as political animals. That's a line from Aristotle. Perhaps the simpler way to put a good deal of the proceeding is that, classically at least, philosophy was interested in three main objects: the true, the good, and the beautiful. The true ultimately is about what we can know about ourselves and reality, and divides itself up into epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, and some others. The good is usually about human action and being, how we can be good and what this would entail, what is the right life to live, what gives it meaning, and so on. This therefore ultimately concerns ethics as the normative study of human action, behavior, and values. Then, third in this trinity is the beautiful, what is pleasurable for us, what is and should be beautiful for us, and how we experience and feel all of this, which therefore makes up an aesthetics arm of philosophy. This trinity is by no means gospel for all philosophies or philosophers, and does not even cover all of the basic subdomains I have just explained. Nevertheless, it does give one at least an initial and easily rememberable notion of some of the most basic and classical general objects of philosophical inquiry, namely what is truth, what is goodness, and what is the beautiful. One other way to fill in a basic notion of what philosophy is to note, but by no means comprehensively explain, for there are too many, that alongside, but also often in contrast with the main and rather permanent philosophical subdomains like aesthetics, ethics, and metaphysics, are the more historically contextualized philosophical disciplines and movements. Indeed, there are very many more particular and historically conditioned disciplines and movements throughout the history of philosophy, some that on one extreme perhaps run throughout the whole of philosophy, for example, rationalism, the belief that the use of reason is absolutely key for any philosophical inquiry, to, on the other extreme, some much more historically confined disciplines and movements that are now largely forgotten and untaught. For example, something called occasionalism by Malebranche, among others, which I was taught, but which is not really taught any longer. These movements, especially because they are so variable in terms of longevity and influence, are in a complex relation to philosophy and its main subdomains. I will cover most of the main ones throughout this course, or at least a good portion of them. Suffice it here already to say that focusing on certain subdomains also often brought certain methods and ways of thinking and arguing to the fore, which then through the communal engagement often solidified into disciplines, schools of thought, and movements that often lasted years and even centuries. There are too many to enumerate, but they can often help define the subdomains depending on the philosopher and the discipline he or she follows. So, example, you can have a rational ontology, metaphysics, and ethics like Spinoza did, or you could have a more mystical, intuitive system of thought like someone like Meister Eckhart had. Moreover, within all of this, some historical periods very much focused on, utilized, and argued for a key kind of privileged concept. So you have medieval philosophy and a monotheistic conception of God as underpinning pretty much everything. You had existentialism and its emphasis on human freedom. And by doing this, by focusing on a particular concept, this kind of also formed a kind of school or discipline therefrom. So medieval philosophers, or a philosophically grounded religion on one hand, and existentialism on the other example. And then on the other side, you have other foci that gave birth to ideas, disciplines, movements, and systems of belief that reached way beyond their own epoch. For example, ancient Greek skepticism had its influence all the way up to Hume many years later. And even today, phenomenology has now branched out way beyond its kind of initial academic specialization in philosophy. Considering all this, there is thus a general interweaving of key subdomains and the ebb and flow of dominant trends, disciplines, and movements, all of which is highly complex, and thus is another great reason to take a primarily historical approach, so we can see how things develop step by step without hopefully getting overly lost or confused. Lastly, regarding content here, as a kind of way of summary of points that we've already had, largely, we can also answer the question, what is philosophy, a bit more directly by briefly mentioning some key elements and traits that have already been more or less present in what we've seen. First of all, it should be clear that philosophy would not exist in humans were it not for our general curiosity, our inherent questioning and inquisitive nature. Philosophy, in a way, is just an amplification and systematization of this, which also necessarily involves our inherent capacities for reflection and introspection. Wherever there have been humans, there has been this fundamentally inquisitive, questioning attitude, with the Western variety being precisely just one instance. Secondly, as many of the names and terms of categories already indicated, running throughout a lot, if not all, of philosophy is logic, broadly construed. So logic can be, in its more narrow definition, kind of the basic rules of thought or even of reality. And indeed, this and its history is always taught as essential in any introductory degree to philosophy, in the first year usually. More broadly, though, this also underpins, logic also underpins the reasoning and the argumentation throughout philosophy. In providing answers to fundamental questions, it is not good enough to simply state what you think. You also need to supply reasons and arguments for this. Reasons and arguments that your peers will be convinced of or not, and they will seek further clarification, evidence, and justification. Here, even though there are irrational strands in philosophy, and even though there are, ironically, arguments that too much has been made of logic and argumentation throughout philosophy, namely that there are more intuitive and aesthetic insights that can also provide reasons that reason itself cannot. That's an allusion to a famous Pascal quotation that the heart has its reasons that reason doesn't know. In spite of all of this, logic, reason, and argumentation in philosophy they're never really far away, even if they are only in a negative, denied form. Even the structure of our language depends on these elements. Thus, with the questioning thrusts and our capacities to provide reasoned answers, arguments, and debate them, Philosophy then circles around understanding fundamental issues and concepts, explaining these issues through concepts, and showing how they are significant for human life, both in theory and often in praxis as well. Much of philosophy is very theoretical, dry even, although there are clearly more concrete and practical branches and applications as well, like in ethics or political philosophy. And I think it needs to be remembered already that even the most seemingly abstruse reflections can ultimately be connected and even support more concrete and applied elements. And thus a great deal has the potential to have very real effects on our thoughts and thus on our behavior and societies as well, even if it is only years or even centuries down the line. And indeed, philosophy does take time, not only to study it, but often to have its effects, kind of trickle-down effect. Effects, however, that are often profound, and thus it was, is, and will always be a serious and crucial human endeavor and vocation. We will see in this course a cherry-picked selection of the best, most famous, and influential such insights, which have had effects that their authors could not have fully predicted. Indeed, if philosophy is primarily about understanding and explaining basic concepts, it is good to remember that these concepts, because they are so fundamental, have extreme power too, including practical power. One simple example is freedom. This may seem a common sense concept to us now, but it is something that has been and continues to be discussed and rigorously debated, including its mere possibility, its nature, and its importance for us. And thus it is one small example of something that has been formed by philosophical inquiry and debate, and that we will see much more of as we proceed. Before finishing, I would just like to briefly outline a few course disclaimers. I've already mentioned that this is an introduction to Western philosophy, so for those interested in Eastern or African or other forms of philosophy, they'll have to unfortunately look somewhere else. This starts in ancient Greece. It goes through the medieval period, mainly in Europe, then the modern period, also mainly in Europe, up until contemporary period in Europe, North America, and now it does have a global reach and influence as well, although there are, of course, other philosophies that shouldn't be forgotten. This is also an introduction for beginners, so it will aim mainly at the most historically famous and established ideas. It will give rather simple explanations of them, as you might get in any first-year bachelor level introductory course to philosophy. Therefore, although it presupposes an interest in philosophy, it should be accessible to all people from all kinds of backgrounds, and will perhaps be overly simple and introductory if you've already had some university level philosophy. It could be a nice reminder of some of this as well. Related to this, as an introduction and as such a massive subject, there are bound to be many gaps, not only due to the immense subject size, but also due to my own limited capabilities and tastes. Nevertheless, I believe I have covered all or most of the shining lights and ideas in the domain, although this of course never is perfect for all. All of these elements considered, it should still provide a solid, informative, and hopefully interesting and inspiring introduction. So I hope you enjoy it as we move forward together. Generally, the course format revolves around lectures like this one, although from now on, each lecture will be focused more on a particular period, movement, and even a particular philosopher. On top of the lectures, I will have recommended readings at the end of each, a quiz for each lecture, and an optional final assignment. It is important to do the quizzes, I think, preferably right after the lecture, as they will help you retain some of the most important points. Any queries along the line, you can also contact me by email, which is found my email at the beginning of each title page for each lecture. So that's it for this time. I hope to see you next time. Thank you very much. And here are the recommended readings for this week. yeah, Copplestone is massive. It's 11 volumes, and Russell's very well-known work. Thank you.